Welcome to Lecture 5 for Lifespan Development in Social Work. This week we're going to be dealing with cognitive growth. In fact, for the next 2 weeks we're going to be focusing on cognitive issues such as growth, theories of growth and development, theories of how memory works, etc. This week we're going to be focusing on two main theorists about cognitive growth, and that's Piaget and Vygotsky. My guess is that some of you have at least had some exposure to Piaget, if not Vygotsky. Okay, Piaget's approach to cognitive development was such that there were 4 stages that children went through in their cognitive developments. Now, what we mean by cognitive is cognitions, thoughts, thinking, and the way in which the mind deals with information from the environment and then stores it and uses that information at a later date, or in the immediate moment, or at a later date, I should say. So anyway, this is regarding how children think and how does their thinking develop according to Piaget. And like I said, he has 4 stages, and we will go through those. Quickly, I'll just say this: sensory motor, pre-operational, concrete operations, and formal operations. And like I said, we'll get into that in a moment. For Piaget, cognitive development included both the content and the quality of knowledge, and that this content and quality of knowledge increases over time. His focus is on the change in understanding that occurs as a child moves from one stage to the next. Because this is a stage theory, previous stages a person must go through previous stages in order to be able to advance to later stages. A person can't skip a stage. A person needs to go through all of what we typically go through for each stage, and then we can move on to the next stage. Movement through these stages occurs with both physical maturation, particularly brain development, and experiences with the environment. These can be social experiences as well as the physical, tactile, visual, sensorial experiences of the environment. Piaget believed that infants have mental structures, which he called schemes. Another way of thinking of these, another way of labeling schemes, this is my language now, are categories, mental categories that people use in order to, shall we say, store the information that they receive from the environment and then are able to retrieve it in some understandable way. So he believed that there were organized patterns that people use starting in infancy within the mind to be able to organize, to be able to use, retrieve, and understand the information from the environment. Now, there are 2 principles that underline this growth and development of cognitive growth and development and the development of schemes over time. And that is assimilation and accommodation. Actually, when we talk about assimilation and accommodation according to Piaget's theories, we're talking about the process of adaptation. And Piaget, what he means, or how he uses that term adaptation, is that it is a process in which new information from the environment is taken in and then responded to. And it occurs in 2 ways. Either the new information is assimilated into categories or schemes that are already present, or the new information is stored into new categories or new schemes that the person develops in order to store the information. That is, with assimilation, typically the information although it is novel, there are categories for the person to use to store the information. So, for example, if a child, an infant, knows the difference between a ball which is an object. Let's say that's one scheme or category. And a cat. And the category that the cat would be placed in is animal. And then the infant meets its first dog, shall we say. A category for animal is already present. So the new information, dog, is assimilated into a previously established category. Accommodation is when the information is so novel that the individual must create a new category or a new scheme in order to store the information. Now, I want to be very clear that although Piaget introduces these ideas at the beginning of cognitive development, according to his theory, adaptation, both assimilation and accommodation, occur throughout the entire cognitive development process as well as throughout the lifespan. So typically for children, infants and young children, because every piece of data, let's say, or information from the environment is new, they are constantly accommodating. That is, creating new categories and categories within categories in order to be able to store the information. As we get older, because we have so many categories already in place, we tend to assimilate new information more. The way an adult knows when they are faced with accommodation is often adults experience accommodation when they are faced or when they are placed in new, very novel environments. Let's say they travel to another country, they've never lived outside of, let's say, their own hometown or their own country. It has very different customs, very different ways of doing things, of course a different language, etc. And the adult is faced with having to accommodate that new information. That is, creating new categories, creating new schemes in order to be able to retrieve the information and understand the information later on. Excuse me. Okay, so let's get started with the first stage in Piaget's stages of development. This is the sensory motor stage of cognitive development. It lasts from approximately, from the time of birth until approximately age 2. Piaget's initial major stage of cognitive development can be broken down into 6 sub-stages. And this is what he did. And our readings will cover this. Before I get into those 6 sub-stages, sensory motor, each of the names of the stages tells you what Piaget thought the main cognitive activity was, how a person gets new information and understands that information from the environment. As you can see, we have sensory and motor as the basis for the first stage. That is, Piaget felt that the main way an individual interacts with their environment is through their senses and through their motor activities. This is how they think. They think with their body. There's nothing there, so to speak, in the mind. There are no real schemes or categories. And so the only way that they know how to deal with the environment is through the senses directly and through motor activity. And the first sub-stage is really around simple reflexes, such as the various reflexes determines the infant's interactions with the world. And we're talking about now during the first month of life. So this is at a very early stage, the newborn. And according to Piaget, the way a child interacts with the world is purely through reflexes. The second substage is what he called the primary circular reactions. This is an activity that an infant goes through that permits the construction of the initial cognitive schemes or categories through the repetition of a chance motor event. Now, we're talking about basically from the first to 4 months of age. So the child begins to discover that there are patterns in the environment because they keep running into the same, let's say, situation or information. And this is what he means by circular reaction. The third substage is what he called the secondary circular reaction. This lasts from approximately the 4th to 8th month of age. And this is when the child begins to develop some motor, some control over their motor, their reflexes, and they now can create their own circular reactions in the world. So they may grab a rattle and rattle it, or they may keep pushing a rattle or pushing a ball or touching a ball, and so they create this circular process. The fourth substage is coordination of the secondary circular reaction. That is, from around the age of 8 to 12 months, we start noticing more goal-directed behavior. And that's because the child now is developed enough to become more physically independent from its caretakers. So children at this point, infants at this point, can purposely, proactively, I should say, go out into the environment and create these secondary circular reactions. Typically they play with toys, they may touch the same objects, they might put the same ball in their mouth, etc., etc. And this is when we start seeing children their minds really starting to develop very specific schemas now. They know certain items will have certain sensations. They associate those items or objects in the environment to those sensations, or that information to those sensations or experiences, and they purposely engage in that. So they're literally thinking, according to Piaget, with their bodies and their senses. Also, there's the development of what he called object permanence. This is the realization that people or objects exist even when they cannot be seen directly in the present moment by the infant. This is the kind of thing where if you take a ball and put it behind your back, the child realizes that although the child cannot see the ball anymore, they know that the ball still exists hidden behind the back. That's the idea of object permanence. We then have substage 5, which is the tertiary circular reactions. This occurs from 12 to 18 months of age. These are deliberate variation of the actions to bring about desirable consequences, so goal-directed behavior becomes even more specified, there may be even stages to the goal-directed behaviors as opposed to just 1 or 2 behaviors that are involved. There may be a series of behaviors that are involved in order to achieve the goal for the sensory experience. And then substage 6 is the beginning of cognitive thought. This is an interesting thought, so to speak, by Piaget. This goes from approximately 18 to 24 months, and this is when Piaget believed that children began to show the capacity for mental representation, or that they have an internal image of a past event or object. And that's the important thing, that not only do children remember, let's say with object permanence, that they remember that an object still exists in the present moment, but they can also now start having these kind of these memories based on previous experiences. And we see this with what he called deferred imitation, in which a child may observe another individual, and then maybe several moments later, whoa, am I having a hard time expressing this? Let's start over with this. Deferred imitation is when a person who is no longer present in the here and now for the child is then imitated by the child. who has witnessed similar acts. Okay, let's move on to the next stage, pre-operational stage. This is characterized by symbolic thinking. This is between the ages of 2 and 7. Piaget saw the preschool years as a time of both stability and great change. Preschoolers are, as I said, in the pre-operational stage, which is characterized by symbolic thinking. Reasoning with the use of concepts, concrete concepts, I might say, begins to appear in children's thinking abilities. But children are not capable of organized, formal, logical mental processes that involve abstract thinking. That doesn't occur until later in adolescence in particular. But children are able to start thinking rationally at this point, logically, but in concrete ways. A key aspect of pre-operational thinking is the symbolic function, that is the ability to use symbols, words, or an object to represent something that is not physically present. In fact, it is during this stage that language develops substantially. We will talk more about that. I don't want to go into a lot of that right now, but we'll talk more about that in a later lecture. Other typical aspects of this stage are what Piaget called centration. It's the process of concentrating on one limited aspect of a stimulus while ignoring other aspects of the experience. This is a major characteristic of pre-operational thought and the major limitation of this period because it leads to inaccuracy of thought. Centration is the idea that a child might only focus on the color of, let's say, a piece of clothing while ignoring other aspects of the clothing. So they become somewhat fixated, if you will, on a particular aspect of a concrete object. We also have what he called egocentric thought. This is thinking that does not take into account the viewpoint of others. And this typically takes two forms. There's a lack of awareness that others see things from a different, literally physical perspective. And there's a failure to realize that others may hold different thoughts, feelings, and points of view from that of the child. So this is a literal sense of egocentrism, where this is not the more common notion of somebody being egotistical. This is the idea that children, although they are able to think symbolically, they are still very concrete in their thinking, so that it is difficult for them to imagine, let's say, an object from another person's physical point of view, or the experiences that other people have that are different from that of the child. Let's move on to concrete operational. This is characterized by concrete use of logic. While the pre-operational child can use symbolism, we start to see a child showing the first stages of logical reasoning. It's not until the ages of 7 to 12 that these skills, or abilities according to Piaget, fully develop. But remember, it is still concrete, meaning that even though a child's ability to think logically improves and increases during this age, it is still heavily focused on concrete ideas and experiences versus abstract ideas and experiences. The school-age child enters the concrete operational stage between the ages of 7 and 12, which is characterized by the active and appropriate use of logic. Now again, younger children can use logic, but not always appropriately. in this stage, we start to see children be more consistently logical in their thinking. Concrete operational thought involves applying logical operations to concrete problems. Children at this stage can solve conservation problems. Because they are less egocentric, they can take multiple aspects of a situation into account, a process known as decentering. They attain the concept of reversibility. They realize that a stimulus can be reversed, returning it to its original form. This is very important with mathematics. A child is able to understand that when they add 6 plus 4, they get 10. And they also understand subtraction, that if they subtract 4 from 10, they get back to the number 6. Despite their abilities to do this, they are still tied to concrete physical reality, and they cannot understand abstract or especially hypothetical thinking or reasoning. Okay? And that's when we move into formal operations, which is characterized by the development of the ability to think hypothetically and abstractly. And this starts around the age of 12 and continues throughout adult life. Let's see. Adolescents are characterized by Piaget as being like scientists who utilize systematic hypothetical thinking to solve problems. This begins, as I said, around the age of 12. Adolescents use formal logical principles to formulate abstract steps to solve problems and to test their hypotheses. Adolescents start with a general theory and they deduce explanations from it. This process also distinguishes the formal operational period. That is, it allows the adolescent to think hypothetically and abstractly. It's during this time that a child, or an adolescent in this case, can not only think about whether they want to be a fireman or not in the future, let's say, or a nurse, or the president of the United States, like sometimes you get younger kids thinking in those ways, but where a child, an adolescent I should say, is able to think more realistically. Well, what options do I have? What are the plus and minuses to those options? The adolescent can begin to not only think about these options, but even imagine themselves in those future careers, in those future circumstances, in their own mind. So they're able to use this very hypothetical approach to thinking. They can also deal with abstract ideas such as love, patriotism, truth, let's say, ethical concerns or issues. So we really start to see adolescents be able to show for the first time in their lives this kind of cognitive ability according to Piaget's theory. Now, the ability to think abstractly affects everyday behavior. Adolescents use formal operations to increases their ability to think abstractly, which I just mentioned. Adolescents become more argumentative. They find flaws in other people's arguments and rules, including authority figures. They may also appear indecisive as they consider multiple sides of issues before making choices. And for the first time in their lives, they are kind of bombarded with multiple choices. And this is kind of a new experience for people. And it also makes adolescence more interesting but challenging, because at times adolescents can make very risky choices, as we talked about earlier. They can think about these other options. They may tend to diminish the possibility or the probability of certain risky behaviors as happening to themselves. That is due to lack of experience, and because of the new experience of being exposed to many different options, pros and cons of different options, they may not always choose the best choice for themselves and engage in more risk-taking behaviors. So let's think about Piaget. Most developments agree that Piaget's descriptions of how cognitive development proceeds during infancy in particular are accurate. He really was people believe that Piaget was a master observer, and in fact, he based much of his ideas about cognitive development by observing his own children from infancy right up through adolescence and taking notes about how they developed cognitively. Studies do show that children do learn about the world by acting on objects in their environment, particularly when they are younger. The sequence of cognitive development and the observation of accomplishments occurring in childhood, as described by Piaget, are used by many schools to guide instruction. And there tends to be some legitimate, let's say, truth or accuracy to his overall idea about how cognition develops over time. However, there are specific aspects of his theory that have been criticized, particularly his arguments regarding the idea of the mastery of the timing and mastery of object permanence, for example. Some research has shown that, first of all, they question this stage concept. Some researchers have been able to show that you could train children to develop object permanence. For example, some work shows object permanence may occur as early as 3.5 months of age, much earlier than he initially stated. Piaget also tended to underestimate the skills of infants and younger children, in part because of his own narrow methods of experimentation, which was, well, basically observing his own children and other children as well, but not really doing widespread studies to assess the accuracy of his hypotheses. Let's see, what else? There are cultural issues regarding Piaget. Some development is universal. Some of the ideas that he's talked about do tend to appear to be universal, but others appear to be more cultural and subjective. And we'll get into culture and how culture may have a very specific role as to what specific cognitive skills are developed based on the demands and the pressures of specific cultures when we get into Vygotsky in a few moments. Let's see. Also, children in other cultures, some research shows that children in other cultures may differ from Westerners in their demonstration of certain cognitive skills. Not only in cognitive skills, but in the order in which they are able to demonstrate them across time. Another criticism of Piaget is that perhaps there is another stage beyond the formal operations, and this is has been called post-formal thought. You know, the way I'm getting through this lecture, you would think I don't have any thoughts because I keep losing my thoughts. And even I have notes in front of me and I keep losing my thoughts. Anyway, well, that may be a form of post-formal thought or just post-thought at this point. Anyway, developmentalists such as Gisela, I don't know how to say her name, Lebouvet-Vive, I have no idea how to say this person's name, suggests that the nature of thinking changes qualitatively during early adulthood. So once we get past adolescence and we get into that 20 and 30 year, 20-something and 30-something period, that in fact she believes that there is such a thing as post-formal thought, that is thinking that goes beyond the formal operations. Adult predicaments are sometimes ambiguous, she argues, and are solved by relativistic thinking rather than just pure logic. Post-formal thought also encompasses dialectical thinking. That's the idea that a person can appreciate both sides of an argument, both the pros and the cons, and even come up with a solution that might involve a little bit of both ideas, even though both ideas are presented to the individual as being contrary to each other. William Perry, another theorist, examined the way students grew intellectually and morally during college, and we will get into moral development later in the semester. He noted that students entering college tended to use dualistic thinking, something is either right or wrong, good or bad, black or white. Either people are for them or against them. But as the students encountered new ideas and points of view, they began to hold multiple perspectives, or what he called multiple thinking. Both theorists believe that adults are able to engage in what they call relativistic thinking. This is the idea that rather than believing there are absolute standards and values, adults are able to see that different cultures, societies, individuals, even situations for the same individual can have different standards, values, all of which could be equally valid. They may not be equally valid, but a person is able to spend time considering that they could be equally valid. So this is the idea of post-formal thought. There's more information in some of the readings, so please look into that. But now I want to go on to our next theorist, and that is Vygotsky's theory of cognitive development. And as I said in the online, in the information about the lecture and the readings and the topic this week, you'll notice that Piaget his theory of cognitive development really focuses on the individual. What is happening in that individual's mind from birth through 18 or 19 years of age. So it's a very individually focused theory. Piaget's ideas, although does focus on the individual, his thoughts were that it was the social environment in particular, the physical environment, but also the social environment were the critical component to not only helping the development of thinking, memory, which we will get into later, but that there were specific ways of thinking, specific ways of experiencing the world that a child develops based on the culture and the context and even the historical period that the individual is in. So he viewed cognitive development as the product of social interactions. Social interactions were very important in his thoughts. Culture and societies influence cognitive development. Let me say that again. Culture and societies influence cognitive development. It is not just a physiological process that occurs for a specific individual as that individual interacts with their environment. The environment is very unique to that individual based on the culture and the time in which they are developing as individuals. Vygotsky did not totally agree with the idea that children are like little scientists who logically reason and think about their environments and learn about their environments through logical reasoning eventually as they develop over time. But that children are really what he called apprentices in thinking, or cognitive apprentices, who learn cultural skills from master teachers, as he puts it. I like the way that, in fact, I got that from the book, just to be honest with you, from the readings. I really like the way that is put, that in fact children learn to think by observing and interacting with older members of their community. And those older members of the community show the individual how to think about the world and interact with the world. According to Vygotsky, children's cognitive abilities increase when information is provided within what he called their zone of proximal development, ZPD, the level at which a child can almost, but not quite, perform a task independently, but can complete the task with the assistance of someone more competent. Think of it like this. Think of a young child who is trying to learn how to tie their shoes for the first time. And that the adult doesn't necessarily take the shoe, let's say, to the child and say, "Here, put this on and tie it on." No, most people don't do that with a young child who's just learning how to tie a shoe. What the adult typically does is break down the skill into smaller and smaller steps so that with each step it's just a little bit more difficult and a little bit more challenging and based on previous skill development that the child already has. That's what Vygotsky is talking about, the zone of proximal development. There's just a little bit more expectations placed on the child. Here's a little bit more skills that you need to do to accomplish the task at hand. And so the child is able to do most of the task, but still needs a little bit of help to complete the task with that of an older, well, in this case, the master teacher, the cognitive master teacher. He called this process scaffolding. It's the idea of offering support for learning and problem solving that encourages independence and growth in a kind of a step-by-step gradual process. The aid that more accomplished individuals within a community, within the community in which the child grows up in, provides the child to the child, the aid, let me put it this way, the aid that more accomplished individuals provide to learners comes in the form of what he called cultural tools. Actual physical items such as pencils, paper, calculators, computers, books, weaving, farming. There are these specific tasks that children are engaged in the environment by older members of their community to help them move into and become further members of their community as they gain more of these skills of independence and participation. Okay? And so therefore, obviously every culture has certain skills that are emphasized more than others. So that would influence how the child not only thinks, but how they interpret and experience the world around them. Really, if you think about Vygotsky, it's really what is called a sociocultural theory of cognitive development. Here's some other ideas that come from Vygotsky. There's apprenticeship in thinking. This is another way of describing what I just talked about, wherein the cognitive and social skills of younger members of a community are nurtured and encouraged by the mature members of the community. Here's another idea, guided participation, which is I was just describing to you before. This is part of the scaffolding process, so that an adult or an older member may first role model the skill, break down the skill into smaller steps, and then guide the child literally through each of the steps as they develop those skills over time. Vygotsky did believe that these processes that he's described are universal across cultures. But as I said earlier, the specific skills required to adapt and thrive are particular to the culture and the milieu that the child is located in. So Vygotsky believed that cognitive development was intrinsically a social phenomenon from the start, as seen by the role of communication. Obviously, cognitive development, according to this thought, this way of thinking, sees it as a very interpersonal process. And so therefore, through communication, verbal communication, gestures, that sort of thing, the child begins to learn not only about what tasks to do, but starts to learn language, communication skills, language acquisition, etc. He was most interested in individuals within the community, which included family, schooling, social, and historical context in explaining cognitive development. Now, I want to be really clear that Vygotsky and Piaget were not completely opposed to each other. And if I remember correctly, I have to admit, I don't have this in my notes, Vygotsky actually developed his ideas first before Piaget. But he did believe that there was a developmental process, that is Vygotsky, that was going on. That the cognitive skills, let's say, of a 10-year-old were much more advanced than the cognitive skills of, let's say, a 1-year-old. So he didn't he did believe that there was this process of increasing ability and skill over time with cognitive development. He was less interested in what the specific stages or processes were, what skill comes first before the other skills. Okay? So, let's do one more thing about Vygotsky, and that's really looking at him and appraising him. When we evaluate Vygotsky's contributions to cognitive development, we should remember several things. Vygotsky's view has become increasingly influential in the last decade. It's very interesting. Piaget was very, very influential and is still influential, particularly in the West. But Vygotsky's almost kind of been revived, if you will, or has been discovered maybe in the last 20 years or so, particularly in the West, Western Europe, and in the United States and North America. And so it's become much more influential. And if you think about, when we go back to our first lecture about social systems theory, the epigenetic theory, the idea of genetics and physiological development are intimately involved with the social and physical environment, and each influences the other. Vygotsky's ideas of cognitive development really fit in very well with those kinds of ideas of both systems and epigenetic theory. Mind you, he developed this idea before systems theory was around, or certainly before epigenetic theory was around. Really, his ideas help explain a growing body of research that attests to the importance of social interaction in promoting cognitive development. This idea of the zone of proximal development is not precise. It's not easily testable, let's say, but there seems to be some evidence of this when we watch older members of a community interact with younger members in a community. Again, I mentioned that Vygotsky really doesn't talk about specific cognitive functions. He doesn't even talk about memory. He doesn't talk about attention, so in that way it's limited. But it is broad enough to encourage, I should say not to encourage, but to include the many different ways that children are raised and yet still develop cognitively across multiple cultures. That is our lecture for this week. Thank you for your participation, and I will talk to you again next week. Bye-bye.